Any questions?
Michael Rowan, Rob, straight back at you. What do you think is the biggest challenge faced by this industry versus dealing currently?
I believe that the industry needs to look further than just doing 3D and really concentrate on structuring the information to make it reusable, especially for the owner. I suppose, firstly, we'd be kind of looking at a 3D model to avoid clashes and stuff like that. I think that kind of day is gone, that we need to be looking more at what the information within the model that can be passed on for the owner and to the maintaining of the facility over its life cycle.
No problem.
A question for Dan. Maliki Mathis from DIT. Dan, is there joined-up thinking between the likes of yourselves and the BIM academic forum? Is there joined-up thinking between undergraduate education and postgraduate education?
Between BRE and this particular course, or generally?
Generally.
Generally, there is a little. What personally I've been working with is I'm part of the BIM 2050, the youth group, and as part of that, we're having lots of discussions with stakeholders such as the BIM academic forum and people like Alison from Class of Your Own and other people who are looking at kind of education, not just for BIM but for the construction sector generally. In addition, Building Smart International are currently looking at a international learning outcome framework to certify kind of courses and things like that, and the idea is that they're starting with this kind of foundation level stuff, and the idea is we're going to then start building up and looking at the undergrad and the other stuff, building our way through the process. So we haven't got to that point yet. We're starting at the grassroots first and building up. But at that point, we will be engaging with them. But at this point in time, it's aspirational as opposed to practical.
A question for Tom. In your presentation, you mentioned that the information manager would author the EIR. Is he the right person to do that, or is it the client who should be authoring the EIR?
It's the information manager authors the EIR, but with the editing undertaken by the client. It's a collaborative piece of work that will arise from the information manager really getting to grips with what it is that the client wants, what they need, by talking to their FM teams in particular, and the people that run the operation. But just in terms of all the documentation, somebody has to author it, someone has to put the name to it, and that's the information manager. But it's a joint venture between the client's O&M team and the strategic BIM manager.
And just from your experience on projects, are you seeing EIRs are being developed typically on projects? I mean, we're seeing other projects that are not introduced on.
The projects that I work on have EIRs because I'm kind of a BIM guy, and so I do insist that we have them. On the Turner Townsend, we use them on all our BIM projects. Prior to working at Turner Townsend, I worked for a local authority over in the UK, the East Rhine Yorkshire Council, and we had our own EIRs that we did in our BIM jobs there, which were based on the documentation. Interestingly, the EIR that we developed, the very first time we used one, it sent the architects and the design team into apoplexy. We can't do this is far too onerous. I don't think it is. So we went through the EIR, we had a big meeting, went through it step by step, and at the end of that first meeting, we ended up putting an awful lot more requirements in the EIR because we realised we'd been vague, and it's essential.
So finally, just in terms of the information management role, I mean, it suggested that would be the lead designer in the design stage and then pass over to the main contractor.
It can be.
Are you seeing that in practice? How are you seeing that?
In the jobs that I'm working on, no, it's not happening that way. It's a separate role because it's difficult to do another role as part of your central role in any job, because you end up paying lip service to it, or you don't do one of the roles properly. It's a good idea to take it outside of that environment, outside of another job, and just have one person responsible for that information, and that's their core role within that project. I would always advocate the use of a separate person to do it, with task information management requirements as you go down. But I think you need a strategic information manager.
So, Tom, you mentioned EIRs and the focus on FM and engaging back and forth. Do you find PAS 1192-2 emphasizes facility management in EIRs and BEPs?
I don't think it does. I don't think it doesn't. It doesn't. I think this is just a hangover from the way that it's so that the BIM softwares are so obviously graphical, and I think it's seen as almost instinctively it's seen as a design tool, and people forget that it's actually all about the information. And I think that happened with the documentation when that came out, that it was, people were wowed by the visual side of things, so we started focusing on that. And then as only as we've got into it, we're going, oh, hang on, it doesn't really matter. That it's all about the information, it's all about the building operation. And that's been, I think we're late to the game with that. And it's difficult once the rabbit's out of the trap to kind of bring that in and say, stop thinking about the visuals, start thinking about the information, managing that, because, and this is why you hear about this, you know, instead of CapEx and OpEx, start thinking about TOTEX, which is vital that the clients do that, but clients don't do that at the moment. It's going to take a big mental shift to do that.
Yeah, hopefully the PAS 1192 is -2 is revised to focus more on FM, because it states clearly that the handover to your client after construction, your as-built model, should be a COBE model, which is an extraction from an IFC model. Okay, so how are you going to plan that out clearly in your employers, your EIR, and in your BIM execution plans? So it should be stated in that document that you need to prepare in this fashion. So it's just something to think about. The documents are great, but sometimes once you start using them, my students come to me all the time very frustrated because they're really trying to use these documents, you know, in everyday practice. And we can see these conflicts, and these things are noted.
I think it's an iterative process. You do it on one job, it's not quite right, you refine it and you refine it. In a couple of years' time, it'll be a situation normal where we do understand how it all works. At the moment, still, you know, like Bambi, you know, taking the first steps and skittering around a bit. But you know, we will be there in the end.
Sorry, can I just? Yeah. Sorry, just building on your first point about the client and the EIR. How many of you in the room are designers? Quick show of hands. Keep those hands up. Keep them up now if you consistently receive good briefs of your client. So how can we really expect a client who can't give good briefs normally to be able to give good briefs on technical information requirements without assistance from someone else? I think that's why it's really important to have a kind of good information manager right at the outset of a scheme, before you start appointing designers right at the very first stage, before you even thought about what work you're going to do. Bring them in and talk to them so they can help form this. Because on the off chance that you actually get a good brief, you know how much easier and how much more streamlined you can make your project. So being able to have that help and support will really help streamline this process, to help put in things like this idea of developing the information deliverables towards the outset and the end.
So are you suggesting they're independent from the design teams as well, like an independent consultant?
They could be whoever you want. If the client develops the tools and the responsibilities in-house, it can be on the client side if they have someone who has the capabilities. It's just important that someone is appointed. I believe that on smaller schemes at the very least, you don't need an individual separate to do it. It can always be bolted onto someone else's job, but as they do scale, that does get more difficult. I wouldn't suggest you have someone like a specialist consultant like myself or someone do it. I think it needs to be someone from the design team at the outset who just doesn't have any design responsibility, but then ultimately it depends on who's the most appropriate and what your form of contract is. Everyone works differently, so that's why the paths are set out so that people can share roles, people can split roles, and people can do different roles. So there's flexibility to allow you to do it how you need to, as long as someone has been appointed those responsibilities in the process.
Michael Manning, David Barry. Tom, you mentioned the common data environment there. I'm wondering, what are the essential elements of a common data environment for the implementation of a successful level 2 project? Now, with your personal experience in that field?
That everyone who needs access to it has access to it, and that it's auditable. It's not much more complicated than that. It just needs to be a place where, when it's managed well, anybody that needs the information can go to it and get the current information that is applicable to their task and their job and the project as a whole. So with someone monitoring that, managing that, they can make sure that in you've got it split, as I said before, with the kind of you've got the shared areas, the work in progress files, the shared, the published, and that published needs to have one single element for every task, every job, every drawing, every whatever that is current at that time. And you've just got to make sure that people use it, that people aren't sending things via email to people because it's only a little bit of information. Everything needs to be on there. And it's taken a while to get people used to that.
What systems have you used yourself? You threw a huge amount of software.
I've used 4Ps, the building in BIW, which isn't around so much now, Building Information Warehouse. Buzzsaw is quite good, although it's quite old school in the way that it's just kind of it's almost just an FTP thing. But it's quite good because you've got the audit trail thing there. And you can see when everybody's done it. I've used several. What else did it have? Site Desk, A-Site, all over.
And did these get passed on to the operational phase of your projects, or did they sort of finish with the construction phase?
They've always kind of finished with the construction phase, and that's one of the things that is tricky at the moment, to get the client to understand that if the information goes in there, then they need to continue to pay the fees year on year so the information can be there so they continue to use it. Some of them are starting to, I know that Site Desk do this, is that they will always keep the information available that was handed over at handover and closeout for no more fee. So you can always access that. But if you then want to do more work on your project, then you've got to start paying your fee again. And I think the mindset will change, where people will start accepting that they pay a subscription to their information in the way that we pay our IT teams to look after our data in-house and do all the service and stuff like that. I think people will start paying a certain subscription for the software that allows them access to their data. I don't know. It's a tricky one. Some clients may embrace it, some may walk away.
Well, I'm not sure the principles of being level 2 and especially pushing on to level 3 allow you to kill it for construction.
No. It does, and
I'm just wondering.
it's the mechanics of how it's going to happen.
Yeah.
So the way we handle this at headcount engineering is, it all depends on what type of project you're working on. If you're working on a process plant, we would use Navisworks for open standard point clouds and open standard models in conjunction with a web-based BIM repository, which you can download for free and use from bimserver.org to have access and exchange your IFC models. If you're working on, let's say, a restaurant we just finished in Dublin, I'll suggest that the architect sends in an IFC model, and we'll use Celibri to coordinate. In relation to FM, it's all about the model. So you have systems like Arch FM, which will be a common data environment for your as-built after it's handed over. So what we would do is we laser scan the area, and then we do dimensional control compliance, assure the client what was designed is what was built. So they have a proper as-built model according to an as-is point cloud. And then we hand that model over an IFC file format, which contains all the information, and it also is linked to copyright, as we discussed earlier. So your systems for FM utilize this model, and utilizing an IFC model will facilitate all these needs that you're actually asking about.
I also think it's going to be easy to do the accommodation environment that gets handed over in the end when the FM teams start getting on board with BIM. I personally, do we have any FM people in at the moment? No, Councillor Breeze. I think one of the reasons why FM aren't embracing BIM is because it takes away half of their income stream. Because every 5 years you go to a different FM provider as a client, and the new FM provider comes in and says, right, we will audit everything you've got, and they go away and we will charge you X thousands of pounds for that. If you've got BIM, a well-maintained BIM, they don't need to do that. All they've got to do is just sit back and kind of wait for things to happen. I think that's one of the reasons they're not that bothered about it, because where does the other half of the money come from? As we go forward, going forward, they'll have to accept that's the way it is, and it will become a more kind of integrated process.
Further questions? Yes.
It's a good question for Dan. You were talking about your involvement with looking at BIM for infrastructure in the UK.
Yeah.
I just wondered if you find there are particular specific issues with infrastructure that you don't find with building, as in the building.
I think there are two issues. I think the first one is a cultural one. It's one that we've been affected by at BRE. There's a kind of association with the word building with everything kind of with a roof on it, as opposed to building where we just construct something. That's been found a lot with BIM, where people have said, well, what about civil information modelling? Like, well, no, it's just BIM buildings, you build stuff, that's how it works. And we've also found it personally where infrastructure organisations don't want to associate with BRE. They say, well, you're building research, you're not infrastructure research or civil research, we're not interested in you. So I think there's this kind of real kind of them and us occasionally with some of the terminology that we use. And maybe that, BIM as a term isn't the best one. I tend to use information management and information modelling. You leave off the B at the start. I tend to help with some of this, and I think the fact that it's not really needed, because we're all in the building industry, so there's no point talking about building within building.
I was going to say, I always advocate, I tend to advocate, think of the word building as a verb and not as a noun, and that allows you to get over that hiccup.
For many years I've been teaching BIM in the United States. I started teaching master's courses in BIM around 2007. And the first thing I told the students, integrated practice has been around since the 50s with the automotive industry, and then aerospace, and then through the 70s, started being implemented in the AEC FM industries. So I told the students, we're building an information model. It's not an information model of only buildings. Okay? So everything from infrastructure, every industry does this. So we're building information models. So the first thing I do is create IDEF diagrams of my information. Okay, so integration definitions methodology from the U.S. Air Force. And then that information I put into an object-oriented BIM model, an IFC model. So it's all about the information. And then you can use IDEF for lean processes and things like that to optimize information. That information isn't redundant, information is concise, and information can be reused and used by others in the future by those who implement it now and extract it later. So,
And the second one is appropriateness of some of the attributes and kind of metadata. The work that we're actually doing is looking at expanding IFC to include infrastructure attributes for the Environment Agency. So what they've done is they've given us a list of the assets they have and the information that they hold about them. And the idea is we're trying to look at how that maps to IFC and if something needs to be included. And the short of it is there aren't many attributes that they use that are covered within the IFC schema. Not that I have the list in the back of my head, but some of them to mind were things like with a sand dune, it could be talking about how geometrically stable it is, which isn't really something that we look at in terms of buildings. So I think it'd be quite scary if you had a geometrically stable attribute for your office building. But then it's just things like what attributes that you have for embankments. An interesting one I saw was mudflats. So they only kind of really exist at sort of certain times of the tide. So how do you deal with kind of temporal objects or things that haven't really got boundaries, like unbound spaces? So those are the kind of things that we've been looking at that aren't really covered in the existing schemas because either the key developers in it or the people who have been working within the organisations are building focused. I mean, we've seen with BIM, the general people who've led it have been people from the architectural side. And whether it's because of those kind of initiatives is why it's kind of had this swing more towards buildings, or is it because the people don't really occupy infrastructure assets? So the onus on kind of the FM side hasn't been as strong because you don't really need to sit there and capture road data as such because I don't know about you, but I've seen drawings for infrastructure projects that bear no resemblance to what's built whatsoever. Things will be a couple of metres down the road where they should be. So it's almost pointless in those kind of occasions to capture things. So I think sometimes it comes from who's helped develop it as well. But generally, I think it's the culture and the appropriateness. That's why there are issues with infrastructure and BIM.
so infrastructure and BIM to be implemented properly in the future. This is how the IFC schema was created. Dr. Thomas Levitch, who runs the model support group of the IAI, the International Alliance of Interoperability, created IFC in between 1994 and 1997. So what's saying we should use for BIM level 3 has been around since the 90s. And software like Vectorworks and Navisworks and ArchiCAD have been around since 2D CAD. So integrated practice software systems have been around since the 80s. But the model view definitions are what we need to extract this information for like infrastructure. So I currently review for automation and construction, Elsevier journal publications, and current papers I'm reviewing from global BIM leaders, I can't mention their names, but are proposing new MVDs, some for what you would like and other areas as well. But there's a certification process that must be undertaken. And you have to submit a proposed model view definition to the model support group of the International Alliance of Interoperability. Okay, so then Dr. Thomas Levitch and his team goes ahead and starts experimenting with it. It gets tested and used. So for software vendors like Revit to import and export IFC, it's like a many years process for the software development teams to even be allowed to use this format. So you have some software systems like Vectorworks and Allplan and ArchiCAD who have been on this train from the beginning of its journey. So they're better at exchanging information. I'm speaking so much about IFC and MVDs because we're talking about information management and how information should be embedded in the model and how it's used by all stakeholders. So it's real important that we start getting a grasp of how this really works and then use the guidelines and the documentations and the certification programs to leverage how we implement, our knowledge. Everyone in this room, your BIM is different. BIM is a process. It's not a building model. So everyone's BIM is different, how you use the process. So how you understand the process and choose to implement it in your daily practice is up to you. There's no document that's going to tell you exactly how to do that, I promise you. So it's integrated practice. And Years before, it was virtual design and construction, when I was helping develop 4D and 5D systems, and linking models together, so if I changed costs, it changed the parameters of my model. If I take a window out my model, it takes it out of my elevations, floor plan, schedule, cost has changed. So we have to understand how all these things are linked together. Any more questions?
It's just a quick question for Dan. Are your two-day courses available in Ireland? Currently?
We have two ways of doing it. We either kind of do it at a BRE office, or if you have sufficient numbers, we can come to you. And I think we kind of try and put them on in places other than London, but they haven't been as successful, to be honest. We have it on fortnightly in Watford. We normally fill 30, 35 people in it. I tried very hard to put it on in Cardiff and Swansea, to be technical, and we failed twice. We only got about 2 or 3 people interested, and the third time we only got half a dozen. And bear in mind, people travel, I've seen who's been doing it from Cardiff, Swansea, further on, to go do it in Watford. It's quite painful to see that there's not the interest there. We've tried in BRE Scotland, similar things have happened as well. So if there's the interest, we'll go.
So I'd like to introduce our final speaker.